The lesson today is from Luke. When we came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, and to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of all the synagogue were fixed on him. Then he began to say to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." The word of the Lord.
There is a reason why Luke is often the first gospel that pastors will recommend to new Christians or to those people we call seekers, those who are wondering, what is it about this Jesus that people find fascinating or that people are willing to follow? No one outdoes Luke in emphasizing that this gospel story is for everyone. Both Matthew and Luke have listed Jesus' genealogy. Matthew traces the line of Jesus back to Abraham, but Luke traces Jesus' line all the way back to Adam, emphasizing that Jesus has come to save us all. Jesus, as Luke portrays him, is just awfully easy to love. For the purposes of this series, we are calling Luke's gospel the gospel of and for the nobodies. Many of us may have spent a time, or maybe more than a time, maybe you even feel like this right now, but we've spent time in our lives feeling like someone who is on the outside looking in, someone who is overlooked or dismissed or forgotten. Throughout the Gospel of Luke, these are the very people that Jesus notices, the people that Jesus pays attention to, the people even that Jesus lifts up for the rest of us as examples. Pat read for us how Jesus at age 30 announced the beginning of his ministry, his declaration of who he is. And this is what he said. He is the one who preaches good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the captives or the prisoner, to give recovery of sight to the blind, and to liberate the oppressed. These are not somebodies that Jesus is talking about when he defines his ministry and uses that definition to proclaim himself as the Son of God. Later in the Gospel, when John the Baptist has been in prison for some time and sends his disciples to inquire of Jesus whether he really is the one or should they be looking for someone to come after him, Jesus again points to these very words. He tells his disciples, "Look at what you see. This is what I am doing. I am preaching good news to the poor. I am proclaiming release to the prisoners. I am granting recovery of sight to the blind, and I am liberating the oppressed. This is the proof that I am who I say I am." Now think about that. That is the proof that Jesus is the very Son of God. Not that he has amassed political clout, not that he has gained some kind of worldly power, not that he has become rich or famous, but that he is caring for the outsiders, the insignificant, and the forgotten. Luke begins his gospel by saying these words, "Many of us have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught." Now, over the years, many have wondered who this Theophilus was. And some have suggested that the name, Theo meaning God and Philos meaning love, which put together literally means lover of God, many have suggested that this name implies that the gospel was written for everyone who loves God. And in a sense, that is true. People who love God will find treasure in Luke's gospel. But Luke refers to most excellent Theophilus. It's a title. And so that suggests that this was indeed written to a specific person. Now, it is likely that the person that Luke is writing to is most definitely a somebody, most excellent Theophilus. This may be a person of importance, a person in some kind of authority. But as Luke writes this gospel, then he takes great pains to let this person of importance know that Jesus was a great friend of the nobodies. It is Luke that gives us the most detail regarding the story of Christ's birth. In Luke, we discover that the angel comes to the town of Nazareth, to a young peasant girl engaged to a carpenter. These were simple people who would not get a lot of notice. Nazareth was the town on the wrong side of the tracks. Nazareth was a town of little note. Close to Nazareth was the city of Sepphoris. And if you had a choice, Sepphoris was the place where you would want to live. Sepphoris had streets of shops and better homes, and you can still today walk the ruins of this city, and you get an idea that it was a city of some importance. Nazareth, by comparison, was a nowhere kind of a place. Nobody chose to move to Nazareth. This is the reason why when Philip goes to Nathanael, when Jesus is calling his disciples, and Philip goes to Nathanael and says, "We have found him him, we have found the Messiah. He is from Nazareth. Nathanael answers, Nazareth? Does anything good come out of Nazareth? That tells you a little bit about how that city was thought of in that time. So a young girl and a carpenter from this city of no account probably aren't the people that you would first think to choose for the important job of raising the Son of God. But that is exactly who God chose. And it is Luke that gives us Mary's Magnificat, what the choir sang for us this morning, Mary's song of praise, when she greets Elizabeth, and Elizabeth says to this pregnant young girl, who could very well be killed for her crime of being pregnant outside of wedlock, Elizabeth says to her, blessed are you. And Mary says, with all my heart I glorify the Lord. And he goes on to say what the song that the choir sang didn't say, that song goes on to say, he has looked with favor upon the low status of his servant. He has scattered those with arrogant thoughts and proud inclinations. He has pulled the powerful down from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty-handed. God has lifted up the lowly, filled the hungry. This is the God that Mary praises. This is the God she trusts with her very life. You hear the reversal taking place in that very first chapter of Luke. The lowly, the unnoticed, are the ones who are lifted up, even in the coming of Christ. Then Luke tells us that this couple had to travel 80 miles to Bethlehem shortly before Mary was about to give birth. Now, we have added a few things to the Christmas story over the years. We have given Mary a donkey to ride on. Nowhere in the Bible does it talk about Mary riding on a donkey, but I think that a lot of us just think surely someone gave this poor girl a donkey to ride on if she had to travel 80 miles when she was 9 months pregnant. And then we have the infamous innkeeper who had no room for Joseph and Mary at his inn. But the innkeeper isn't mentioned in the Bible either. And in fact, the word that we often use as inn, no room in the inn, is kataluma, which translates literally as guest room. There was no room in the guest room for Joseph and Mary. Joseph had to go back to the town he was from, to the town of his birth. All of his relatives would have been there. And homes at that time were usually built on top of a cave. And that first room above the cave, that was the living quarters for the family that had that home. That was their kitchen, their living room, their bedroom. Everything was in that room above the cave. And then families who were lucky had a loft, and that would be the guest room. And in the cave underneath the house was where the animals were kept at night. And we are told that there was no room in the guest room for Joseph and Mary. There were probably people sleeping on mats on every available floor space in that home during that time. The guest room would have been full. And if Mary was close to giving birth, they wouldn't have wanted her in there anyway. Because according to the laws of that time, any bodily fluids that, if her water would have broke or something, it would have made the whole room ritually unclean. No one could have stayed in that room then. So there was nowhere to put Joseph and Mary but in the cave with the animals under the home. And that is where Jesus was born. Now, if you have ever been to the Holy Land, and I know some of you have been to the Holy Land, and if you've ever been to the Church of the Nativity, which is supposedly built on this very place where Jesus was born, you know that looking across the countryside, from this side, you see a really odd-looking mountain. It's kind of a flat mountain. It doesn't have a crest to it. And that is because it is a man-made mountain. Herod, who was king of the Jews at that time, had a mountain torn down and rebuilt next to where it had stood. He had people tear down a mountain and then rebuild it right next to where it stood. Now, I'm not sure why he did that. I guess it was because he could. Maybe this was his attempt at the pyramids. I don't know. But on top of this man-made mountain, he then had a palace built for himself. And the ruins of that palace are still there, and you can see that it was quite an incredible place. He had an indoor swimming pool. Now this is desert land. He had an indoor swimming pool in his palace. How do you think the water got in the swimming pool? Servants had to carry it up the mountain to fill his swimming pool. Herod was a somebody. He was a king. He was important. He was rich. He was well known. And he probably never bothered to think about the families who were living across the plain from him in that nowhere town of Nazareth. But Luke points out that it was to an insignificant family in that little town and in a cave that housed animals where God chose for the Son of God to be born. Our oldest son Jacob was born at 5:20 a.m. on a Wednesday morning. And our first call was to Lee's parents because they were flying to Finland at 8 o'clock that morning for 3 weeks. And we had to let them know before they got on that plane that they had a new grandchild. Our youngest daughter Lydia's birth was scheduled. And so my parents were able to come to Kentucky, and my mom and dad were there with us when she was born. My mom was actually the very first person to hold Lydia. And Darcy was the second person to hold her. Then Lee and I finally were able to get our hands on her. But you all know, if you are parents or if you are grandparents, the people that you call first, the people that you choose to have around your newborn child are very special. You don't want just anybody walking in and picking up your baby. You're very careful about who you allow to hold your baby, and you know exactly who you want to call and tell that this amazing thing has happened. Luke tells us that the birth of the Christ child was announced first to a group of shepherds. So let me tell you a little bit about shepherds in the first century. Being a shepherd was not an influential or a high-status occupation. In fact, shepherds were regarded as untrustworthy. They couldn't testify in a court of law because they were considered as a group to be untruthful. Part of that came from the fact that most shepherds only owned a few sheep, maybe 10, maybe 15. They didn't own land. So those sheep had to graze on other people's land. And some people thought of that as stealing. So shepherds were considered rather untrustworthy people. They were looked down on. And shepherds were dirty. They smelled. They spent all of their time among sheep. They weren't very popular with the peoples whose land their sheep went across. But this night, on the night of Christ's birth, it was shepherds who heard the angels sing. It was shepherds who were invited to go and see this newborn baby. These people who were so often looked down upon, even by the other poor people, shepherds were looked down on. These were the ones who were first invited to witness the birth of the newborn Son of God. It gives you an idea of how God loves in this world. Over and over throughout the book of Luke, throughout his recorded Jesus ministry, this regard for the nobodies is lifted up and emphasized. And there are really, I think, two important messages for all of us that comes from this. If you have ever felt like a nobody, if you have ever felt like the person that never quite fits in, the person that everybody forgets about, the person that is just insignificant in the whole scheme of things, then Luke reminds us that you are exactly the kind of person that Jesus notices. You are the kind of person that Jesus goes out of his way to bless, to have compassion on, to encourage, and to include. Luke makes it crystal clear that God not only notices the nobodies in this world, God uses the nobodies in this world to do some pretty amazing things. And if you are a somebody, like Theophilus, whom Luke was writing this gospel for, if you are a somebody that people look up to, someone who is on the inside, someone who has privilege. And Pastor Norby did a fine job last Wednesday night of reminding us that if we are Caucasian, we have privilege in this world. If you are a male, you have privilege in this world. If you have expendable income, then you have privilege in this world. If you have an education, you have privilege in this world. Compared to much of the world, we are all privileged people who are sitting here today. We were blessed to be born into good families, to live in a land of freedom with educational opportunities that many people don't have. We know, if we are honest with ourselves, that many people around the world do not ever experience the blessings that we take for granted. And Luke reminds us that if we are among the privileged, if we are the somebodies in this world, and we want to truly follow Jesus, then we are called to join in the work of lifting up the lowly, of seeing those who go unnoticed, of reaching out to the poor and the untouchables of our day. We are the ones who are called to speak for those whose voices often go unnoticed or unheard. We are called to humble ourselves as well and to let go of our pride. And that can be hard because sometimes we don't even realize our pride until that we are prideful people until it rears its ugly head. It can show up in how we choose to treat those who are there to serve us. Waiters and waitresses, people who wait on us in stores, people who serve us in our schools, in our hospitals, and in many other places. It can show up when we're stressed out and things aren't going our way. And all of a sudden we can say something and we wonder, where did that come from? I'm not that kind of a person. But it happens. It can show up in how we talk about the poor or the imprisoned. It can show up in 1,000 little ways. We are not naturally humble people. I believe that humility is something we all really have to work at by making ourselves do the jobs that we would just as soon leave for someone else to do. You know, one of the places that my pride shows up is when a telemarketer calls me during supper time. And it is a struggle for me to be pleasant to that person. Can you think of a worse job, though, than being a telemarketer? I mean, I really can't think of probably much worse than having to do that for 8 or 10 hours a day to make a living. And to have people be rude to you and hang up on you and yell at you because they don't want to be bothered by you. I can't imagine what that would be like. And yet I do find myself being rude or hanging up. That's pride. As we go through the Gospel of Luke, we will see over and over how Jesus treated the lowly, the easily overlooked, the forgotten. And I hope that as we go through this gospel together during these days of Lent, that this gospel of good news for everyone will move us toward a greater Christ-likeness in our own lives. Would you pray with me? Holy God, we thank you for the good news of Jesus. We thank you for the witness of this Gospel of Luke, which points so strikingly to your love for all people. Help us to place our trust in that love. Help us to see Jesus in all his splendor as he takes time for the people that no one else sees. And help us to be like Jesus in our own everyday lives. As Jesus taught us, so we pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day